Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining today's webinar. This is the first in a two-part series on the future of study abroad during this pause in programming. My name is Megan Zacher, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the interim project director for the capacity building program for U.S. study abroad, also known as IDEAS at World Learning. I'd like to introduce Ms. Heidi Manley, the Chief of USA Study Abroad, part of the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. She serves as the lead for American student mobility within the State Department and oversees two of the department's leading programs to support American students, the Benjamin A. Gilman International Scholarship Program and the Critical Language Scholarship Program, also known as CLS, which she launched in 2006. Heidi also has the lead for creating and overseeing a number of capacity building initiatives to increase and diversify American student mobility, including the capacity building program for U.S. study abroad, which is for accredited U.S. higher education institutions and is also known as IDEAS. She also leads study abroad engagement grants for U.S. embassies and Fulbright commissions worldwide. Heidi previously served as the Deputy Director of ECA's Office of Global Educational Programs and as Special Projects Officer in the Office of Academic Exchange Programs, where she oversaw a number of programs and initiatives under the flagship Fulbright program. And I'll turn it over to you, Heidi.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. So good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. With almost 400 registrants, I want to make sure I'm welcoming everyone who is joining us from across the country. I am absolutely delighted to be here with you all today. I apologize in advance if there's any technological challenges on my end, but like perhaps many of you, my children are home and engaged in virtual school, which uses an incredible amount of our bandwidth. And the fact that my children are home with me and that I'm at home addressing all of you is a reminder, not that I need one, of the unprecedented time that we are all in. This past spring, we assisted in evacuating over 750 of our Gilman scholars from 90 countries around the world, while borders were closing and flights were being canceled, seemingly in seconds. We are so grateful to have had the support of so many of your institutions, as well as our amazing colleagues at U.S. embassies and consulates and our wonderful partners at IIE to accomplish this difficult and, frankly, disheartening challenge. And then we, along with our partners at American councils and overseas, canceled our in-person Overseas Critical Language Scholarship, or CLS program, and managed to launch a virtual program for 6 of our languages in 7 weeks, with additional virtual language institutes taking place this fall. And I would be remiss if I did not note that our Gilman and CLS applications are currently open for your students, so I had to put a plug in there. We are frankly busier than ever, I feel like, but we are also, like many of you, looking forward to the hopeful, strong return of American student mobility and the factors that need to be in place for the return of our own programs. The conversation we're going to have today on safety and ethical considerations of when to begin is important to us, and judging by the huge response, important to all of you as well. I want to thank our 3 panelists today for being here with us and sharing the thinking at their own respective institutions. We are joined by Andrea Bordeaux from Vanderbilt University, Grant Sisk from Dallas County Community College, and Michael Zoll from the SIT Graduate Institute. Thank you all so much for being here today. I'm also grateful to Megan Zacher from World Learning and Rebecca Gailey from my own team for making this event possible. And finally, I want to thank all of you for being here with us today. I am really looking forward to hearing your questions, your comments, and your concerns. So thank you again, and back over to you, Megan.
Thank you so much, Heidi. And now I'll do just a quick brief overview of World Learning and IDEAS. World Learning, Inc. is a nonprofit organization that encompasses SIT Study Abroad, the SIT Graduate Institute, the Experiment in International Living, and Global Exchange Programs in Washington, D.C. We partner with USA Study Abroad to implement IDEAS, and the overarching goal of this program is to expand and diversify U.S. study abroad. It does this through an annual grant competition, of which the winners have been announced in July and are found on our website, which is studyabroadcapacitybuilding.org. And we also do in-person and virtual activities like the one you're participating in today. Our hope is that today's webinar, The Future of Study Abroad, How to Decide When It's Safe and Ethical to Begin Again, contributes to your institution's study abroad planning as you decide when and how to safely resume international exchanges for Americans in the future. We're delighted that this webinar gives us the opportunity to collaborate with Andrea Bordeaux, Grant Fisk, and Michael Zoll, as Heidi mentioned, and I will now turn this over to them to introduce themselves and get our webinar started. Andrea, do you want to start introducing yourself?
Sure, absolutely. So hello, everyone. Andrea Bordeaux, Vanderbilt University. And I think it's important to mention that my role serves all of our students, faculty, and staff here at Vanderbilt. I support all undergraduate, graduate, and professional travelers, as well as our faculty who do research abroad while they are here at Vanderbilt. And so this topic is very near and dear to my heart.
I'm Grant Fisk. I'm with what was formerly Dallas County Community College District. We've collapsed down to Dallas College now. We're the one college multi-campus format. Like many of you, we put study abroad on hold for the time being, but we're working through the issues you are too. I work in the Office of Global Economic Development, but like Andrea, I oversee all of our study abroad, faculty travel, anything international in that regard. And so naturally that folds into the risk management piece. And while we have other people that look at the associated risk with any kind of travel, I focus on that as well.
And good afternoon, good morning. I'm Michael Zoll. I'm the Dean of Student Health, Safety, and Wellbeing at SIT, the School for International Training. And my role there is very much at the intersection and juxtaposition of students, student affairs, in a traditional role, as well as my title reflects, health, safety, and well-being of students. So the risk management and the kind of overseeing, working closely with the Director of Security and Risk Management, all of our programs at the graduate level and at the study abroad level, for which we have quite a few.
All right, I'll get us started here with our official welcome and then just wanting to share an agenda with all of our participants. We are going to go through the topics that you can see on your screen today. We're going to go through the general COVID-19 study abroad landscape as we currently see it. We're going to talk a little bit about inherent risk versus the new risk realm that we're all working in as it relates to COVID-19. We're also going to chat a little bit about study abroad and its impact on the economy around the world and what it means for not only the US, but the many countries that American students typically go to and travel to every year. We'll also talk a little bit about a proposed model, if you will, for a pre-departure training and how we'd like to move away from the idea necessarily of orientation versus that training perspective. We will tie all of these concepts back to the ethics of study abroad, which and restarting our travel in this new space. And then finally wrapping it up with informed consent, what that means and how to interpret the best way to put it in place. I do want to encourage everyone to please put your questions into that chat. As Megan mentioned, we really want to keep this conversational. We do have material obviously to present to you and to share our ideas with you, but we want to hear your questions. We want your comments, and feel free to address them to one of the three presenters, myself, Grant, or Mike, or it can be a group question and we can all tackle it. So once again, thank you for being here. Next slide. All right, we're going to start with the logistics in the COVID-19 landscape. And what I mean by that is sort of separating the world into study abroad pre-2020, what things looked like maybe this time last year when we were all preparing students to depart for their spring semester abroad come January, versus the landscape that we're in now, study abroad today. What does it mean if we have students away this fall, or we're planning to have students away in the spring? Or what if we're not? What if we're not going to have any of those things happening for a while? So basically wanting to look at logistics in a new way. In our pre-2020, pre-COVID world, setting academics aside for a moment and focusing purely on the financial and the safety elements, a big part of, I think, what the field of study abroad looked at was how do we prepare students and their families to financially take on study abroad? What does that look like? And we had a pretty strong, framework and rubric out there for how to talk about that question. In terms of safety, the conversation, I think it always looked a certain way. We were talking about personal safety. If there are health concerns prior to departure, if there are health concerns, in country while you're abroad. But it was easier to sort of think through what those could be ahead of time, since we felt that, we were able to plan a little bit better. Obviously, we're in a new place right now, and we all know that, we have to change our thinking in some ways. The three main things I think that have really drastically shifted from that pre-2020 landscape are predictability, preparedness, and risk tolerance. Exactly what Heidi mentioned in her introduction. Predictability, obviously, we've all been tested in this. Vanderbilt also did quite a bit of student evacuation around the world back in February, March, and April of last year, of this year. Wow, it already feels like 21. And so, predictability is now not what it used to be. Many of our institutions probably look to the U.S. Department of State for travel advisory updates. And we were able to kind of, keep an eye on those and look for expected shifts based on what was going on in the news or what we knew was coming down the line. That's not the case anymore. We're seeing sort of, rapid shifts in these things, and we can't necessarily know anymore with any certainty what another country might decide to do, as Heidi mentioned, with border closures happening with, in minutes or without warning at all. And so predictability is a big challenge for us right now. Preparedness is going to take on a little bit of a new meaning, in the sense that, the training that we sent students off with in the past, will it be enough in the future? And that ties into what we'll talk about later on here a little bit, and that's duty of care, and how we actually work through the concept of informed consent. And do we all feel comfortable that students understand and are on board with what they're signing on to? And finally, that risk tolerance piece. Before COVID, we would talk to students and their families about their risk tolerance, and it really was focused on the student and family. So a student approaches a study abroad program, they want to participate, they need to obviously work with their family about any, risk concerns for their personal safety or their well-being. But in the world we're in today, that extends so far beyond the individual. And it extends also to the institution. And that's something that's important to remember now. And so the risk tolerance matrix is probably more complicated than it's ever been. Next slide. So first and foremost, I think we're probably, many of us are coming from institutions that want to have a student-centered approach, or to put our students first. And so thinking about our responsibility to them, I've mentioned the concept of duty of care, a bit of a legalistic concept in the sense that for a long time, what it used to mean, I think for a lot of folks, had to do with insurance. It had to do with, have we provided our travelers with the appropriate insurance policies? Do we have the appropriate insurance in place? Do we have the appropriate waivers in place? Have we shared the information that we need to? And have we provided the assistance that we should? And that can take on, many different forms and levels based on the resources of any particular institution. And so that's sort of what it used to mean, but where is it going in the future, and what does it mean today? And I think, there's been a push for a long time when it comes to study abroad safety, that we need to do beyond the minimum. It's no longer okay to simply send students on a program that, has been pre-approved by an institution for years on end and hasn't had any review or keen eye put to it to really look at things. Are these programs serving our students the way that they should? And are these locations where we want our students to be. And then also, hearing the feedback from the students as well, and making sure that, they're confident in where they're going. And so it's really, we're moving toward a collaborative process. And that's where that necessary shift from orientation to training occurs. I put a couple quick little notes on this slide to indicate that orientation in and of itself, when you think about what that means, it's, positioning with relation to points on a compass. But what does that mean for study abroad and how we prepare our students versus training or the act of teaching a particular skill set? And I think that's what we're, our goal, our aspirational hope here is that we could get to a place where we felt like the institution and students were all on the same page in that regard. Next slide. And so that brings us to risk tolerance. And this is a big topic. So I will try to break this down as carefully as I can. Risk has never been absent from our work, and that's an important consideration here. I think that if I'm speaking for myself, I think what I've seen in the field is that COVID has pushed quite a few institutions and probably quite a few individuals to this place of thinking that maybe we need to eradicate the risk of COVID before we can logistically do travel again. And I don't know that that's the best framework to approach this with. Risk has always been part of our work. I mentioned something referred to here as an international travel risk matrix. This is something that I've used in my career and something that we have here at Vanderbilt that we apply to all of our travel experiences for our students. And we can break things down looking at assessing risk in terms of, do we have an undergraduate student or a graduate student? Is this somebody who has language experience in the location that they're going to, or is it their very first time traveling abroad? What is the level of on-site support that we're talking about? If we're talking about a program that has a very high level of on-site support, we're probably going to see that as a lower risk. Along with, of course, taking into account security ratings and State Department ratings and things like that. But how do we calibrate a risk matrix for COVID? And the reality is that it touches every single criteria of any risk assessment approach. So it will affect the personal risk tolerance of an individual, the medical and safety, ratings in a country, access to healthcare, access to transportation, all of these things will be touched. So, calibrating a risk matrix for COVID is something that I think our field needs to think about. And this is indeed a unique challenge. I have often explained to folks in the past, when they ask me what it means to work in international safety and security in higher ed, I say that a big part of what I do is I manage perception versus reality, and perception is reality in a lot of ways to our students and their families. And so if you would have asked students and families, a few years ago, what was the greatest risk to you traveling to Western Europe on study abroad? I know that those of us who lived through the 2015 Paris attacks would probably hear quite often, well, terrorism would be a great risk. And it's, the reality, that's the perception. The reality was always that transportation accidents remained the number one risk to our US students abroad. And so managing that perception versus reality, paradigm is going to be something that we have to do moving forward. And I think, as I said at the beginning of this slide, institutions have to set attainable goals in how we move forward with international travel. We have to do risk mitigation, which is what we've been doing all along. We mitigate the risks that are inherent, that have always been there. We cannot remove them. And so I think if we are able to separate that out and agree, amongst ourselves and with our travelers, that risk will always be there. We just have to figure out the best plan for mitigating that, and how do we get everyone on the same page? Next slide. And so that brings me to what I hope, and this may be a bit of an idealistic view, is for a nuanced approach. Something that I think is important to remember is that there are students who want to go. There are students who want to get on planes. They want to experience their study abroad that they had been thinking about maybe since before they came to college, or since they arrived. I can speak for my part here at Vanderbilt University. We have hundreds of applications for the spring 2021 semester. There's been no official decision given yet on whether or not that semester abroad is going to happen or what it will look like if it does happen. But I think we have to remember that the student experience is very big here. It's a huge thing. Risk tolerance will vary. We will see students who will absolutely not travel or be interested in engaging in study abroad until they feel very confident that their risk level is low. But we will also see students, like I said, who are ready, who are already filling out applications and who at least perceive themselves to be ready. And that perception of loss, we need to take into account here, that many students will not get to experience or have already missed out on experiencing, the magic of that study abroad time. And so what does it mean for us to take a nuanced approach and to meet our students halfway and share with them that we're trying to take a complex path here in our thinking, and we're not trying to simply have a yes or no approach. And ultimately, though, this is going to be very resource driven. And I think that's an important thing to acknowledge, is what can an institution support? I'm very fortunate to be at an institution that is able to dedicate a role like mine to a 100% function toward global health, safety, and security for travelers. Not every institution is able to do that. And in that light, I think you have to figure out what is realistic for your institution. Do you have a way to assess programming by location? Would you be able to offer potentially a suite of programs as opposed to simply offering a green light to study abroad at a particular moment? And so that's going to be part of what we share. And then finally, just to mention that I think communication will be key. The students need to hear the plans ahead of time. Families need to know, and the institutions need to know as well. And so there's just this closely interconnected framework where communication is going to be how we build trust. I think when it comes to the ethics of starting again, and having students and their families trust the decision making that universities and institutions of higher ed are making. Next slide. And so this is just a very quick visual overview of the current state of study abroad, and this will lead us into my colleagues and fellow panelists' next topics that they're going to go over with you. And the state of study abroad right now, starting at the very top, front and center with the students. There are students who are currently abroad for the fall semester. Very few, but there are some. And there are those who are already applying for the spring. And so that's something to keep in mind, that there's a varied landscape already here. For institutions of higher education, I think quite a few are still on the fence right now about how to handle spring 21. I know I'm at one of those that I think really wants to take that nuanced approach, but how to make it work is a very challenging thing. Study abroad providers, those third-party providers that we can lean on for programming, and we have to remember that many of them, unfortunately, have taken a pretty hard hit right now due to COVID and the evacuations that had to occur in the spring, and the financial impact of all of this. And so, will our study abroad providers be ready and able to accept students and have that be the experience that it would have been? So that's just a question to keep in mind. Our in-country providers and partners have all been touched by this as well. Many institutions have staff who live and work abroad. Others have just one-on-one partnerships with folks abroad. And so that's just something, again, to keep in mind, the impact of those individuals and the country itself, finally. And so that's going to tie in nicely to a handoff here to Grant, who's going to talk a little bit about the economics of study abroad and how it affects the actual countries that our students are going to. But I wanted to tie all these things together in this little circle, just to show how every single piece is connected, linking us back to that communication being key. So from here, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Grant Sis.
My camera is working. It seems to be right now. Thank you, Andrea. That was a great introduction. When thinking about the ethics of study abroad, thinking about the economic impact on the host country might seem a little bit odd, or it might not, depending on your thoughts about that. If, like me, you've started to venture back out and eat out in restaurants, you may find that you're tipping your wait person higher than you did pre-COVID-19, because you're starting to realize that their livelihood depends on your patronage, so to speak. And so, without being diminutive of the countries that we like to send our students to, they're dependent in a surprising amount, dependent on our dollars being spent in their country. If you look at the figures here, you can see that according to the Open Doors report, which I'm sure most, if not all of you, are familiar with, a combined total of about 380,000 U.S. students went abroad in 2017, 2018, and about the same amount for 2019 as well, it looks like. When you look at the top 5 destinations of all tourism, the GDP for these tourist locations from tourist dollars is 14.3% for Spain, 13% for Italy. You can read all that going on down the list there. Next slide, please. So I titled this Anecdotal Evidence because there's really, I haven't found a study yet that looked at just the amount of dollars that study abroad students spend in these countries. It's tied to tourism. So if anybody out there is looking for a good master's or dissertation topic, you might consider that. I think it could yield some interesting results. Anyways, the top 12 study abroad destinations also comprise the ones that were hit hardest by COVID-19 and are also the largest of the world's economies. When you look at the industries that are affected by that, it's across the spectrum, from restaurants on up to universities, to individuals who are relying on the study abroad providers that they work for. And then you see a ripple effect also on individual spending, souvenirs, tipping, shopping, anything that you spend outside of the trip cost there. You can see that 32% of our students go to these 3 countries here. As an example, I'm not going to, hopefully I'm not boring you too much already, and I'm not going to bore you too much with this, I hope, but the gross domestic product of Italy is $2 trillion US. And if tourism accounts for 13% of that, that translates into 260 billion US dollars. Now, to break it down a little bit more, about 10% of the tourists, according to the numbers that we looked at earlier, and this is all fuzzy, but about 10% of that would be reflected in study abroad, which would wind up being, for Italy, about $26 million that they're not getting. We're not going over there. Next slide, please. So jumping off that, I want to go quickly into the pre-departure training and something that we touched on earlier. As Andrea indicated, you have orientation versus training, and orientation is, as she said, it's sort of a broad spectrum. There's the exit door if the place catches on fire. The training would be, here's the exit door and here's how you open it, right? And so I think what we're going to see probably in the COVID-19 new reality in terms of best practices is that we're going to start moving our orientations towards training for specific, to address the specifics of COVID-19 and perhaps illness in general. I've done a lot of work in Southeast Asia, so if you traveled over there or if you're there right now, you know one rule of thumb is don't drink the water. One issue with COVID-19, it's easy enough to do, right? You know, you just drink bottled water or something else. But with COVID-19 being a kind of an omnipresent threat, you can't avoid places where COVID-19 is, right? Because it's everywhere. Let's look at the next slide, please. Some of the issues that we're running into, of course, is that we have to figure out how are we going to deal with this, because we have prohibitions against answering students or making students answer specific health-related questions. You know, have you had this? Have you had that? Some ways that I think we might get at it is mention COVID-19 in our waiver, what we call the boilerplate. You know, that part in your waiver where it says, if you go on this trip, you know, you may die because of acts of God, terrorism. You know, we have this whole long list of things that that might happen to you, all in the expectation that they won't. Where we would veer into training on that would be what we do with like our water safety courses for study abroad trips that are going to go to, say, Costa Rica on a marine biology trip. In our boilerplate, we're going to have drowning in there, but if students are going out to you know, the Sahara Desert to study artifacts of some description or other, we're probably not going to worry too much about them drowning. On the other hand, if they're going to Costa Rica, as you may know, the coast there has some pretty dangerous riptides that if you get into can create a lot of trouble for you very quickly. Ask me how I know this. It's very unpleasant. So when we send our students somewhere like that, we're going to spend a lot of time training them on the water safety. It's not just going to be mentioned in orientation, but we're going to say, if you get into the situation, this is what you do, this is what you don't do. And so with COVID-19, we would likely start moving that direction too, with very specific tools for how do you try, you know, how do you minimize risk? What do you look for? If you think you're getting sick, what are the symptoms? Things of that nature. So specific versus general. And then, of course, I think, as Andrea mentioned, we're all wrestling with when can we safely, quote unquote, and ethically return to study abroad. And regarding our institutional policies, are we going to have blanket policies that say, okay, we're just not going to do it until this, or are we going to go on a case by case? Well, this country seems to be safer than that country, so perhaps we can ethically go. Next slide, please. And that leads us to Michael.
Thanks, Grant. Appreciate it. So as Grant mentioned, when we all are trying to decide when is it safe and ethical to begin again, we need to think in various ways. I'm going to look at a couple of intersections of things today. Informed consent, as Grant alluded to, pre-departure training, we're calling it training today, and perhaps on-site training as well. But also tied into the ethics, the issue of ethics, and we'll go from there. So next slide, please. And at the risk of being slightly pedantic, let's start with a quick refresher on ethics. It's one of those terms I have found that it's easy to think you know, but really, what is it? So just for a moment, ethics, simply defined, is here on your screen. It's fundamentally about goodness. It's about decisions, and it's about behavior. And it asks such questions as you see on your screen, what is a good life? How do you live a good life? What are our obligations to one another? To whom are we responsible? Among many, many other questions. So the process of ethics gets us to think about goodness and how we act and what we are obligated and responsible for to one another and to ourselves. Next slide, please. So for us today, I mean, I'm going to posit that doing the right thing is the ethic that we'll want to just the simple doing the right thing. I think is a famous movie of the 80s talked about. And so let's talk about informed consent a little bit. Informed consent, and here is the definition relayed about informed consent. Another term that you may have run across and work with regularly, but if you stop to think about, as defined, permission granted in the knowledge of the possible consequences. What I like is the example, and I've adapted it for our purposes today. That which is given by a student to their school for participating in education abroad with full knowledge of the possible risks and benefits. That is the permission which is given by a student to us, the institution, for participating in education abroad, them acknowledging full understanding of the risks and benefits. Next slide, please. So there are some elements to informed consent that I just would like to go over too. Now, I'm now drawing on a source that is not from higher education per se, it's from the medical research community, which I think can teach us a lot about informed consent. Because when you really think about informed consent in terms of medicine and research, there are some best practices there that have been honed over the years, and some serious consequences if they're not handled or uplifted correctly. So, you know, has the student, and again, I'll use our context, has the student received the necessary information, verbally and in writing? We'll come back to verbally in a few minutes. Has the student adequately understood the information that you're trying to convey to him or her? And then after considering that information, has the student come to a decision, you know, without any kind of coercion, undue influence, and et cetera? Next slide, please. So there's a process that it follows, informed consent follows, again, drawing from the medical community as a best practice and kind of a template here. That information is provided, it's understood as well. It helps to make the decision, and that the comprehension of that decision is monitored and maintained over time. So when we think about this, I'm going to focus on that last bullet point just for a second. I think the first three maybe are obvious, although number two, sometimes we wonder, we see a signature on a page, an informed consent form may be signed and it would appear that it's understood. A signature might imply that, but is it? And also comprehension, monitor, and maintain, that would imply an ongoing sort of understanding. And so do we have a mechanism in place for dynamic monitoring, maybe updating of the situation, COVID being a great example of something that's dynamic and ever changing? Once a student perhaps has arrived on the scene and is working in country with their in-country team, faculty and staff and so on. Next slide, please. So again, a takeaway from this little quick refresher, slightly pedantic, I apologize, on informed consent is that the process of informed consent is ethical, not just legal. And this is, again, drawn from the sources in our medical colleagues, research colleagues, that comprehensibility is essential, right? That the folks that we are attempting to gain informed consent from, our students in our case, is both verbal and written, that we're checking for understanding through the process, and that there's been thoughtful consideration by them of everything we're trying to relay to them. Next slide, please. All right, so now I just want to slightly take us now into what we're working on, this intersection of these ideas, but now add a public health pandemic, COVID-19. Next slide. How might we pivot then? What are some of the questions that we ought to ask ourselves? At my institution, the School for International Training, you know, we are one of those institutions that did run a small number of programs this fall, very few compared to what we would normally run. And we went through some deep thinking about ethics, the ethics of running a program. Of course, the safety elements, but the ethics. And in sitting and thinking about what we should do and how we should do it, I worked carefully with our legal counsel, who I'm crediting here with some of these questions, because we stopped and thought deeply about things such as, well, how do we meet one another? And who I'm talking about there is the institution and the student, right? How are we now going to be in a collaborative mode, as Andrea mentioned about, in looking at risk and looking at working together? That, you know, informed consent is one thing. The institution relays that to the student and the student acknowledges that. But we're in a different world now. We're in a world where it takes a village. It takes all of us. It's the pandemic will not tap any one particular group on the shoulder. It could affect a faculty member just as easily as a student. And then also we have the ethics of our local teams, our in-country teams. At SIT, we use homestays almost exclusively. So we've had to think a lot about that environment, that wonderful environment under a normal circumstance, but with COVID implications, what does that mean? And going both ways, both to our students and to the local families. And so the technical question that I put here really is, what is the intersection of our duty of care, which, you know, Andrea detailed a little earlier, and students' understanding of risks, right? And Andrea, I think, did a great job talking about that notion of risk in terms of risk allocation. How are they allocating their own tolerance of risk? What is the student's personal tolerance of risk in a COVID world? So we worked at SIT on a couple of things. We really thought about transactional realities, that is a shared responsibility. So we're really addressing this now as we are working with you, students, and we're in a partnership with you, and it's a reciprocal relationship. To manifest that, something we did different, really for the first time, and again, we're talking about just a handful of programs, is that we had a pre-departure workshop, training, I should say, with our students and the in-country team and a few folks from the home office. We typically wouldn't have done that, not with 70 programs a semester, but we did it this time. And we focused on the transactional nature that I'm talking about. How are we going to be prepared and ready to respond to COVID? We had a risk assessment plan that we had developed that we shared with students. Typically, those sorts of plans are our internal guideposts. In this case, we made it open to students. We shared it with their sending schools. We shared it with their parents. We wanted them to see the comprehensive planning we had done and that their in-country team had done to think about the risks. And we wanted to share the burden of that risk with them. Again, that we're all in this together, and that, you know, informed consent now really is about duty of care from the institution to the student and helping them understand that we can't protect them from all things at all times. And I think a pandemic is a great example of that. However, we are responsible for environmental safety and for education and for helping them understand the scope and limitations of duty of care. On the same note, that students have a great responsibility as well, not just for themselves, but for the community for which they're in. Because as we know, community interaction in COVID is a spreader. And so if we can't prevent COVID within the community, we're going to have some challenges that will affect the entire cohort. And so we had these sessions that really helped, I think, students understand that we built almost a likability in the group in talking about things that are typically just a form and look very legal and very intimidating. And so what we did is we came up with an assumption of risk form, which I know that many of you have done, specified for COVID only. I mean, this was a breakout kind of assumption of risk, informed consent approach, not a waiver, you know, but definitely something we wanted students to be thinking about. And we used it and walked them through it in the Zoom session that we had, in this pre-departure Zoom session. We wanted them to not just see it and sign it, which they probably wouldn't really take much time to read, honestly, do you? In this case, it was a 2-page form, but we walked them through it. We made it we animated it verbally. Again, back to that verbal piece and that being something that's comprehensible. We wanted them to understand it. We took time through the reading of it to see if they needed any understanding checked and if they had questions. It worked very well, I think, because we expressed the fact to them that we're not going to hold anything back. We want to be completely transparent about the situation. We want to have a relationship with them about risk and about limits of risk and about assuming risk. And then again, we're in this all together. Finally, I would just mention that I think it's important that when you're working with students in an environment, as you all know, you're professional educators, that this is an opportunity to educate them. It's an opportunity to connect with them, and that's why we did it at SIT, because we think that in the long run, we'll have lower risks. We tried to, again, understand our audience. It's very important to understand the generational characteristics from working with students and kind of what works and what doesn't in terms of mediums and communication. And their own perspective on things in the world right now. And to do so, we got them talking a lot. I think half of our session was them talking. And if they didn't ask questions, then we would ask them questions to bring them out. So it's a best practice that I just share with you. I don't know if it would work in your case. We are quite small right now with the number of programs we have. We're not usually quite small. We're committed to scaling up and doing this regularly for as long as it takes and maybe forever, because we think it's a good thing. So again, I'll stop there. I believe I'll turn this over to Megan at this moment, who will take us into the next section, which was really your section to ask questions or share learning with us, and as we learn from you. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for that great presentation. We can move into questions and comments now. I've been collecting your comments that have come through the chat window and the Q&A window, and I will just start reading them off. And directing them, and all of the presenters can answer them as they come through. So the first question is for Andrea. One person has said, one thing we're hearing from Germany is that the costs of duty of care are higher for American students than any others. How do we counter the sense of our people on the ground that our students demand more than other students from elsewhere in the world?
Okay. Great question. And I saw when I took a quick look through the chat that there was another question that was sort of similar to this, or at least a comment that was following on as well. And yeah, it's true. U.S. students do carry the perception that our duty of care is more costly, both in money and time. But something I would probably, say to counter that is that it's a two-way street. Having good policies in place help both the sending and the receiving institution. And it really depends on the nature of the relationship you're asking about in that sense. So are we talking about the relationship between an institution in the United States and a direct enroll relationship with a host institution in another country? Or are we talking about a relationship with a study abroad provider? And so I think, in some ways that comes down to the home institution deciding what level of on-site support it wants to make sure it wants to guarantee that its students have access to. Because I think, many of us in the field have probably experienced that direct enroll relationships do carry a little bit of a heavier burden in terms of the student may not feel quite as well supported as if they were participating in a study abroad provider program, something where there's a staff dedicated to the international student, in this case the U.S. student, on site. So I think it really depends on a lot of specifics in that case.
Thanks, Andrea. The next question is directed at all of our presenters, so any of you can feel free to jump in and take it. And it is, what are your thoughts on student housing options abroad, host families, shared apartments, student residences, etc., and their different risks in this COVID-19 landscape?
I'm happy to offer an opening comment on that. I think it depends on the program and the location. But that said, right, there are some best practices that are at play here domestically, and it would be true anywhere, right? That when you can afford a single room, it's better than a double. But if you can't, then you can go forth, as many of our domestic schools have done, but you need to exercise greater caution. I think what I mentioned in my presentation is it's home stays we really grapple with and are grappling with. We'll continue to, again, from an ethical and safety perspective. And I don't have a clear answer for you on that, except that we would look at each country in each specific situation differently based on its own, as we do our very individualized, comprehensive risk assessment by program and country. So it would depend on that, but we're very cognizant of that issue. So you're asking the right question. Housing is key. the housing situation, not just the environmental one, but also the controls, the housing controls. By that I mean the staffing, the support that Andrea's talked about so much, the support element of housing and meeting your basic needs, including dining as part of housing.
Mike?
I don't really have anything to add to that. We're wrestling with it as well, and certainly open to anybody's suggestions. So.
Yeah, I'll just chime in to say that I think, you know, it again, this goes back to an institution's resources. If your institution is well resourced and is able to do the vetting of each of these options for each location, by all means, I think you should be taking that case-by-case approach if and when you can. However, we all know realistically that that's a heavy burden to bear. And so, you know, in the short term, we may be looking at things like, you know, if your institution doesn't have the resources to necessarily dedicate that time and energy program by program, location by location, perhaps, you know, the single independent housing option is the way that, you know, you may want to look for a short-term period, or at least in your initial reopening period. Because as Mike, you know, eloquently put, every step you take away from that ideal, that single space living situation that is most controlled, every time you introduce a roommate or a housemate, host family, that circle, as we all know here in the US, that circle continues to widen and it makes it very hard to control for.
Thank you all. The next question is, how you talked a lot about pre-departure orientation versus pre-departure training. And one attendee has asked, how do you propose doing something specific for training on COVID-19? In that, how do you think that would best be done, rather as a general health module or a location by location training? And if you would say a location by location training, how often would you plan to update that training?
I can just share an example, and then I'll give it to Andrea and Grant that we did on that very point. Again, in these Zoom sessions that I mentioned, again, this is a practitioner's example, right? We showed a video that our director of security found from, and we'll send this link later. It's a nonprofit that makes it available to any nonprofit, disasterready.org, as I recall. But it was a really wonderfully put together video, short, relatively short, 8 minutes, and then a follow-up one of 4 minutes that we thought got to the education necessary, the awareness, I should say, the understanding of COVID. We didn't want to assume anyone knew anything. It was well done. And then also some secondary kind of information, kind of the training piece, right? The skill building on how you can prevent being a spreader and also prevent getting COVID. That was part of our, again, these pre-departure workshops, and you know, we're going to continue to do that. We're going to keep looking for resources that speak to students, this generation of students whose concentration is really not 8 minutes. And so we have to keep thinking about that and how to, again, animate and make this process one that's effective.
Yeah. And just to jump in here, I think what we have to remember, and this goes for every element of good pre-departure training, is bring in the experts. Don't let it fall to yourselves to create an orientation training or a pre-departure training that is somehow, you know, the perfect resource on teaching about COVID. Obviously, this is still so novel to so many of us, and we keep learning something new every day, every hour, every minute. So bring in the experts. Look to organizations, health organizations on your campus. I know that our student health center here has been so incredibly valuable during this time, and the level of expertise that they have when working with students specifically is a great thing to tap into. So never be afraid to ask for, you know, that expert guidance.
I don't really have anything to add. As I indicated earlier, we have not resumed travel yet, so we haven't had to wrestle with that piece specifically. But I would just second what Michael and Andrea say, which is, and particularly being the experts and listen to them, and you know, just treat it like you would any other kind of training. I mentioned water safety earlier. It's very specific. You've shown what to look for, what to do, what not to do, and so that's the approach that I think we will most likely be taking too.
Thank you. I'm going to combine two questions here, again for all of the panelists. The question is, how do you anticipate monitoring and enforcing student behavioral expectations, such as social distancing and masks, when they're on site, especially considering a lot of students were challenged by these rules when they're on campus? And the follow-up question to that is your thoughts on student traveling further abroad outside of their initial host country while they are studying abroad, if people or students rather should be allowed to leave their host country and travel further abroad.
If helpful, we can.
Earlier, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Earlier today, I was talking to a faculty member who is planning a trip and just mentioned that they might tack on 2 days in Amsterdam, and I said, well, okay, but you know, bear in mind. And so we talked about that a little bit, and what I was explaining to her is that you can only do so much, right? I mean, and what we really focus on is two things primarily. You know, if it's illegal here in the U.S., then pretend it's illegal there. And then at the end of the day, you really can't physically constrain students. And so you have to have policies in place, and they have to be very well aware of those policies. And the consequences of breaking those policies. And so you just have to say, you know, if you do these things or if you do not do these things, you know, here's the range of punishment you might face, up to being, you know, having to return from the trip, being expelled from school. You know, just I think we will probably treat it as a code of conduct type issue when we get that far down the line. Sorry, Andrea, I didn't mean to step on.
No, not at all. That's great, and helps me with a good segue. I think, you know, this is going to be a challenging question. This is a challenging question already in the field. Every time I do a pre-departure training, when I work with faculty-led programming, I'm always asked, how do we enforce code of conduct, especially on short-term programs when we don't have a lot of time? But how do we, you know, work with our dean of students offices back here in the US who are more familiar with handling conduct cases on campus than they are handling conduct cases abroad? I think, you know, we have to step into the realm of uncertainty here and be comfortable with the fact that we're not going to be able to guarantee conduct anywhere ever. We can't do it now. This ties back to when I mentioned setting, you know, unreachable goals, unattainable expectations. Humans will be humans, and on some level we have to account for that and move forward in the best way that we can. If we have mask policies in our classrooms abroad or in our housing areas abroad, then those can be enforced. And again, setting expectations and communication is key. If a home institution has a clear set of expectations laid out with a third-party study abroad provider or with a host institution ahead of time, and the student is in clear violation of those, and everybody was clear on them from the start, you're in a much better position than if you're sort of making it up as you go along. And I think, you know, we all know that. So I think it's best to have clear expectations from the start. Only build into those expectations what is realistic. If students are living alone and masked at all times, and if they choose to travel, there's a certain amount of that's you know, their own personal risk choice in that sense. You know, universities learned, I think, when we were evacuating students this past spring, that you can't, we can only recommend, we can't enforce any travel necessarily. We can't tell someone to travel, and we can't tell them not to in some senses. We can tell them that if you leave the program site, there are consequences, and here's why. And again, that goes back to that communication piece. So building a collaborative approach where students understand why you're telling them what you're telling them, instead of just perceiving it as punitive, is probably the best way to approach that.
Thank you. Mike, did you have anything you wanted to add to that question?
My colleagues handled that wonderfully. I think I would just simply add that in the community itself that forms is the greatest strength. And so, as Andrea and Grant both mentioned, that is the strength to build the trust in that community, the expectations that let students develop norms, which hopefully will emerge the very essence of this question, and they'll work to enforce it themselves in an ideal situation.
Wonderful, thank you. Unfortunately, it's already 3 o'clock, and so as we have so many great questions to answer and ask, but I'm going to have to end the webinar. So with that, I want to say thank you so much to Andrea, Mike, and Grant, and for all of you for joining us today. If you're interested in more and other resources on study abroad and from this webinar, please check out the Library of Resources on the website. There will be a recording of this webinar posted there, as well as I mentioned. I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that this is part of a 2-part series on the future of study abroad, and the next webinar will be on October 22nd. It's on risk mitigation in a COVID world, and I anticipate a lot of our conversation will continue where we left off today, depending on how things change between now and then. But registration is open now and also found on our website, which I will pull up for you. And until then, following this webinar, you'll receive an email, like I mentioned, requesting your feedback via a short survey, and we thank you in advance for completing that. And thank you again for joining us, and we wish you a safe and happy remainder of the summer. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.